There is a sentence in a book published in May of 2022 that nobody talks about enough. It was not written by a journalist or a political analyst or someone with a grievance to file. It was written by a woman who spent 4 years as one of the most powerful people inside the Trump White House. And she wrote it about her own marriage in the past tense, with the resigned precision of someone filling out a form about something that has already happened. She wrote, "George and I may not survive. Apparently, I cannot compete with the tweet, or 90,000 of them. 90,000 tweets about one man, from inside the same house where the person running that man's communications operation came home every night." This is the story of a marriage that became a war that produced 3 of the most precisely documented political statements of the last decade, and a moment on April 9, 2026, when the man who fired 90,000 tweets at the President of the United States sat down on a radio program and explained calmly and in full why the President's wife had just walked to a microphone and started talking about Jeffrey Epstein. To understand what George Conway said on April 9th, you have to understand the architecture of what he built to get there. It started formally in March of 2019. George Conway, conservative lawyer, former clerk for the First Circuit, one of the attorneys who brought the Paula Jones case, began posting observations about Donald Trump's psychology in the specific clinical register of someone who has been reading DSM diagnostic criteria with the attention to detail of a man preparing a legal brief. He posted about narcissistic personality disorder. He posted about the clinical indicators. He posted in the language of someone who is not performing outrage, but is doing what he has always done, building a documented argument, one citation at a time, with the specific patience of a man who has spent his professional life understanding that the record matters more than the moment. Trump responded at 3 a.m. He called George Conway Mr. Kellyanne Conway. He called him a total loser. He called him a whack job. He called him the husband from hell. He said George was jealous of Kellyanne's success and bitter over a job he hadn't been given in the administration. He posted it from the residence in the flat, all capitals register of someone who had been awake long enough for the restraint to run out. George Conway read the posts. He looked at the camera. He typed 3 words, "You are nuts." Not 30 words, not a clinical rebuttal, not a paragraph. 3 words, punctuated as 3 separate sentences. The specific typographic decision of someone who wants each word to land before the next one arrives. The period after "you" is doing more work than most essays. The period after "are" is doing more work than most op-eds. Nuts lands in the silence created by the first 2 and does not need anything attached to it. Trump did not post again that night about George Conway. Inside the same house where this was occurring, Kellyanne Conway was arriving home from the White House. She wrote later that she was beginning to feel the specific vertigo of a person required to be loyal to 2 people who had decided to destroy each other, and that the man she had married was doing it 90,000 times with his phone from the room she walked past on her way to bed. She used the phrase cheating by tweeting. She meant it in the way someone means something when they choose a word that is simultaneously precise and devastating and could not be replaced without losing something essential from the sentence. Meanwhile, in the White House, Trump was not keeping the war private. He was conducting it in front of his staff, in front of his wife, in front of anyone who would listen. Kellyanne Conway wrote about the specific evening when Trump called her into the dining room. The starbursts on the table, the muted television, the windows behind his back, and began telling her about the problem. He said, "This guy is nasty. He won't stop. She's my top person. She knows a lot. What are we going to do?" Melania Trump was on the phone. She listened to him. She let him finish. And then, in the calm, unhurried register that the people who have been in the room with her consistently describe as the specific register of a woman who has decided what she is going to say before the conversation begins, she said, "Donald, this is not her fault." She said, "She is a big girl, strong and confident." Then she said the sentence that Kellyanne Conway quoted verbatim in capitals with an exclamation point. The punctuation of a woman who is still, years later, moved by having heard it. "We don't control our husbands, and you don't control us." Trump was perturbed. The starbursts were untouched. Kellyanne Conway wrote that she felt awkward and embarrassed that they had to spend a single minute on this, and yet felt, in the same breath, relieved and protected. The specific emotional combination of someone who has just been defended by the last person they expected to walk into the room on their side. This is the architecture of what the fabrication channels collapse into a single title. There was no live TV destruction. There was no 2-hour statement. What there was, what the documented record contains, is more structurally complex and more revealing. Two households conducting the same war from different directions, the woman at the center of one household defending the woman at the center of the other, to the man both of them were watching, and a marriage built on 90,000 tweets, absorbing the specific weight of a conflict it had not been designed to carry. By 2022, Kellyanne Conway's book was on the shelves. By 2024, the Conways had officially divorced. George kept posting. Kellyanne kept appearing on television in the specific, carefully managed register of a woman who has separated her public loyalty from her private account and has decided not to collapse the distance between them. They had both watched the same men from opposite sides of the same wall, and they had written their conclusions in different registers, hers in a memoir, his in 90,000 tweets and a 3-word sentence. And the record contained both of them. Then came April 9th, 2026. Melania Trump walked to a microphone and held a press conference, without a scheduled briefing, without a communications lead, without the institutional apparatus of a First Lady appearance. She began talking about Jeffrey Epstein, about Ghislaine Maxwell, about what she knew, and when she knew it, and why she was saying it now. The room did not expect it. The networks scrambled. Within 2 hours, the clip was running on every platform simultaneously, and the question that every anchor on every channel was asking, but nobody had a sourced answer to, was, why now? What triggered this? What happened in the 24 hours before a sitting First Lady walked to a microphone and started talking about Epstein without warning? George Conway went on Sirius XM that afternoon. Dean Obadala asked him the question. Conway answered it, in the flat, analytical register of someone who has been watching the architecture of this particular performance for long enough to recognize the load-bearing structure when it appears. And what he said about why Melania did it, and what it signals about the specific pressure point that produced it, is the answer that no network had sourced before he walked into that studio. The confirmation arrived in the cross-reference between Conway's Sirius XM statement and the documented timeline of events in the 72 hours before Melania's press conference, a sequence that, placed in order, reveals not a spontaneous decision, but a response to something specific. Not a woman going rogue, but a woman who had reached the specific moment at which silence costs more than speaking, and who understood, from 9 years of watching the architecture of this particular situation, exactly when that moment had arrived. The woman who said, "We don't control our husbands," in a White House dining room in 2019, walked to a microphone in 2026 and said something that the man at the center of 90,000 tweets had spent a decade building the conditions to prevent anyone from saying. George Conway, who fired those tweets from the same house as the woman who called him a cheater for doing it, whose 3-word response to "husband from hell" still sits in the record at full volume, sat down on a radio program and explained piece by piece why the architecture had finally produced this exact moment. That is not a bombshell dropped on live TV. That is 10 years of documented pressure, finding the one point in the structure where the wall was thinnest, and the specific people who had been watching the architecture long enough to know exactly where that point was. Subscribe and turn on every notification available, because what George Conway said on April 9th is what every network was trying to find. And this channel is the place that puts it in context, in order, with every source attached.